Good afternoon and good morning to my friends west of the Eastern Time Zone. We thank you for joining us for this enlightening conversation that we're going to continue. This is a conversation that began this summer following the Supreme Court decision on affirmative action and admissions in higher education. I'm Dr. Dereck Rovaris. I serve as the immediate past president of the American Association of Blacks in Higher Education. I am stepping in for our current president, Dr. Kimberly Smith, who's called away with work responsibilities. I also serve as the vice president for equity and strategic initiatives at St. Mary's College here in Southern Maryland. Previous to that, I was at Louisiana State University in a similar role. Prior to that, 25 years at Xavier University down in my home of New Orleans, Louisiana. And I am grateful to be able to moderate this panel. We have an amazing collection of individuals, and I will introduce them to you and then allow them to give a brief intro in addition to the comments that I offer up. We are anticipating an additional panel member, and I'll tell you about him in just a moment in following the introductions of our first two. I'll start with Dr. Laura McNeal. She's currently a professor of law where she teaches civil procedure, education, urban revitalization, and law, employment discrimination. And I believe that's at Louisville?
Yes.
At Louisville. Her scholarly interests examine issues of access and equity in employment and education law, with a particular emphasis on issues of access and equity for individuals from traditionally marginalized populations. Professor McNeal has contributed to the national debate on law, education policy, and race relations through op-eds and radio and television news features for the Dr. Phil Show, CNN, MSNBC, CBS, NBC, and various other national media outlets. I noticed Fox wasn't on there, but that's just me. Dr. McNeal, would you give us a further introduction and welcome, please?
Yes, first and foremost, thank you so much for the invitation to participate in today's webinar. It's exciting and a very important topic. I also, in addition to the things you mentioned, serve as a lecturer at Columbia University, where I teach a law and ethics course as well in New York. So I'm kind of a little bit all over the place in terms of trying to get this important information out there. And a little side note, I am from Southern California, but spent my summers in Florida. So sweet tea is definitely my favorite drink. And again, thanks for the invite.
And as a fellow Southerner, you know, I'm in Maryland now. They don't put sugar in tea always. I didn't know that. I thought the sweet.
That's not real tea.
Yeah, I thought tea was always sweet. We'll talk later. Welcome, Dr. Laura. Okay, next we have Cedric Powell. Cedric Powell is the Wyatt, Tarrant, and Coombs Professor of Law and Distinguished Teaching Professor at the University of Louisville, Louis D. Brandeis School of Law. Professor Powell received his BA with honors in politics from Oberlin College and his JD from New York University of Law, where he served as managing editor of the New York University Review of Law and Social Change. Professor Powell served as a law clerk to the Honorable Julia Cooper Mack of the DC Court of Appeals. He was a Karpaktin Fellow in the National Office of the American Civil Liberties Union, and he practiced as a litigation associate with Skadden, Arps, Slate, Mager, and Flom in New York. Professor Powell's articles have appeared in the Harvard Black Letter, Law Journal, Harvard Journal on Racial and Ethnic Justice, Howard Law Journal, University of Miami Law Review, St. Louis University Public Law Review, Washington University Journal of Law and Policy, and the Utah Law Review, among others. An extensive list of accomplishments. Mr. Powell, would you mind giving us a little welcome and a further background, if you would like?
Certainly. It's indeed an honor and privilege to be here with you and to participate in this important discussion with my great colleague, Dr. Laura McNeal. I also have a book out, Post-Racial Constitutionalism and the Roberts Court, Cambridge University Press 2023. I sound like a book hawk, but it's out in paperback. So just came out in paperback. So please look for that. I teach evidence, constitutional law, critical race theory, race in the law, and do a number of other things. But I'm really honored to be here. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And to our audience, again, we are dropping in the chat information. So if at your leisure, you can poke your head in the chat and pick up information. Professor Powell's book is listed there. We'll also give you some information about AABHE, which is the American Association of Blacks in Higher Education. This is an organization that grew out of the American Educational Research, grew out of American Educational Research Association, and became part of an organization that we felt like was so important. It was so important for us to gather together as African Americans or Blacks in higher education to advocate for ourselves, for our students, for our colleagues, and for the betterment of the institutions for which we work. We have a lot of programming, a lot of different avenues for you to participate in. And before we get started, I'm going to share the screen and give you a couple of quick commercials. One is our AABHE Research Institute. Any of you who are currently working on a dissertation, currently trying to write a book like Professor Powell did, or Dr. McNeal, this is an opportunity for you to help get that book completed. We started this institute several years ago, and it met with tremendous success. Those of you who are full-time employees and working in other capacities and trying to write at the same time, this is a great venue to get you moving and grooving, as we say, and making sure that you get that thing done. We will commence Monday and Tuesday, November 6th and 7th. We have limited availability. I don't know if you can scan it on your screen, but there is a QR code here. And if you need more information, I'm sure that Josh will drop it into the chat. Secondly, I want to share an upcoming opportunity that I think a lot of you will find very useful. We have an annual conference every year. This year, we will be in March of 24, we'll be heading to Las Vegas for our annual conference. And right now, there's a call for proposals. One of the best ways to get in that conference and to fully engage is to be a presenter. And so here's a chance for you to present at a national conference. The American Association of Blacks in Higher Ed Conference call for proposals is now. The deadline has been extended. So if you're serious about this, scan that QR code, contact Josh, make sure you participate fully in other parts of our programming for AABHE. And that information, again, will be in the chat for you. So our third guest is quite busy. He is Congressman Troy Carter from the great state of Louisiana. He is on the House floor as we speak because there's a bit of a traffic jam trying to see who will be the next Speaker of the House. And if you've not paid attention, that's very consuming. And the vote started at 10 o'clock Eastern. He was hoping that he could get here, and he said as soon as he gets off the floor, he will pop in. So his bio is one that I'm quite familiar with. I've known Troy since he was a college student at Xavier when I worked there, and he has been elected to the Louisiana House, the Louisiana Senate. He was the youngest person elected to Louisiana House. He represents a swath of Louisiana that includes runs from New Orleans all the way up through Baton Rouge. He is a dedicated servant and has always been committed to not only education, but particularly higher education, and would, if we can, get a chance to join us. But I think everyone would understand his duty is right now to be at that vote to make sure that we get absolutely the best possible person we can to serve as Speaker of the House. So his apologies are there. If he's able, he will join us. And if not, we'll fill in some of the gaps. So with that, we're going to start with questions from me to the panelists present. Audience members, you're able to put questions into the chat, and we will follow a script that gives us all the way up until the top of the hour. And at that time, we will relinquish your day back to you. So first question, actually, targeted toward Mr. Carter is simply this: what role does Congress play in helping to secure the hard-fought victories for justice and inclusion, i.e. affirmative action, voting rights, and full inclusion? With a backdrop to that question, this decision is not in isolation. Many of us have had time since the decision was rendered to look at it and process where it's coming from. But what role does Congress and other elected officials play in helping to shape the conversations and securing the rights that we've won previously? And I'll start with Mr. Powell.
Well, I think Congress plays a major role, and so I'm not a legislator, but I can talk about some things that Congress has done in the past. There was a whole series of cases, and I'm not saying that these cases are related specifically to the affirmative action decision that we'll be talking about, but Congress had a very robust role in the 80s and 90s in terms of opening up business opportunities for minority business enterprises. And there's a whole series of decisions that the U.S. Supreme Court looked at to see whether or not those actions were constitutional. Interestingly enough, they really signal where we are today. So Congress played a very major role in minority business set-asides, but there's a whole series of decisions, Croson, Adirondack, which sort of took away that power. So we're almost back to where we started from there. I think another important area where Congress can play a role is voting rights. The U.S. Supreme Court plays a very important role in signaling to conservatives about what type of actions they'll take. There was a 2013 case called Shelby versus Holder, where the U.S. Supreme Court actually gutted the Voting Rights Act. But that really sent a signal to state legislatures to start partisan gerrymandering, redistricting, and ways to dilute voting power. So the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, the National Voting Rights Act that they're considering in Congress now, and have for the past several congressional terms, would be very important in opening up robust voting activities. And this is not an accident. The U.S. Supreme Court has been very active in erasing voting rights. Shelby County was only the beginning. There's a decision in Ohio that allowed for voting purges to be prevalent, and all of these things to have a disproportionate impact on voters of color. So Congress can play a very robust role in restoring the potency of voting rights in the United States.
And I agree with Professor Powell with respect to the significant role of Congress. I think for me, it takes me back to my civic education back in high school, remembering the importance of those three branches. And a lot of times when we have a situation where the judicial branch, as we saw with the affirmative action case, doesn't get it right, that's when Congress can really step in as an advocate, to be quite frank, for our rights and for the rights of all students, in this case, of color and people of color. And I think, as Professor Powell was eloquently explaining, in terms of voting rights, in terms of, we see obviously Congress enacted Title VII, in which outlaws discrimination in the workplace, discrimination based on race, based on gender. And so I think it reminds us not only of the role they play, the power they have, but the importance of voting, because we need the right people sitting at the table, voting on our behalf, and voting in a way that promotes equity, that promotes inclusion, and that promotes the dismantling of structural inequalities. So I think it's a real wake-up call when we look at this decision in terms of how important it is, who represents us and who is the advocate when those decisions are being made.
I think you all are right on the point of votes and how they matter. Voting is how we got to this place. I was able to participate with the Congressional Black Caucus's conference earlier, I guess it was last month, and of which Congressman Carter is a very active member. Actually, he's second behind Mr. Jeffries in command with that group. And one of the things that they said over and over again at that Congress conference was voting. The Supreme Court is shaped by the folks that get in office, and the three levels that you mentioned, Dr. McNeal, are influenced by completely influenced by the way we vote. And what would you all say? And this is a slight addition to this question. What would you all say to the audience about their role in voting, not only in national, but in local elections? I'll start with you, Dr. McNeal.
I think my biggest message to the audience, and again, don't take this the wrong way, but we simply cannot afford to sit and not go out and vote. A lot of times, things come up, life comes up, but the reality is what's at stake right now is the future for generations of African Americans in higher education, generations of African Americans in healthcare, in workplace discrimination, in voting rights. And so if we don't speak up, I think that it will do irreparable harm. One of my biggest critiques, or rather criticisms, of our legal system is sometimes we don't need lifetime appointments. We see that with the Supreme Court because they can literally yield generations worth of damage based on the laws that they pass, or rather in this case, the cases, how they rule on those cases, and the ripple effects as we're seeing now in higher education. So I think, we obviously remember our ancestors literally losing their lives, right? So that we would have the right to vote. And a lot of times it's really easy to sit and say, you know what, my vote doesn't matter. And what we're reminded of with this historic decision is our votes do matter. So my strongest message would be not only to vote, but also become an advocate in getting others to vote. At your church, organizing for people like elderly family members who cannot get to the voting polls, having some type of pooling service. I don't think it's enough to just simply vote at this point. I think we have to vote and encourage others to vote and increase opportunities and access for them to do so, because the implications are beyond jarring. And one thing that's somewhat sobering as a law professor is seeing down the road just what this means in terms of our ability to have equal access to the various things in society, in this case, education. And, all is not lost. We can definitely reverse the harm that's been done, but we can only do that if we go out and vote. And I'll pass the gavel to Professor Powell.
Well, I think voting is essential to our democracy. And Senator Raphael Warnock calls it almost a prayer from the people about their common interests. And it's a way to express ourselves in the political process. And it's a way to preserve our democracy. It's the only way, really, you can voice your opinions and impact major things that can impact your life, like housing, education, employment, benefits. The whole structure of your life really depends upon how these legislatures make their decisions. And the only way that they make appropriate decisions is if they hear from the people. And even when they make erroneous decisions, they have to have the fear that the people will speak and move them out of office if they're not connected to their common interests. So the voting is very important. And think about how important voting is. There would not be this movement to try to suppress voting unless it was important. I think people think that just because we've had some successes, like state legislatures, the mayor. I'm from Cleveland, Ohio, so the first African-American mayor, Carl Stokes. And some people say Newark, Mr. Hatcher was the mayor, but they came into office at the same time. But that's very important, and we've had an African-American president as well. But we also know that whenever people of color make progress, there's always retrogression and retrenchment. And so the only way that we can really stop that and stay very active is to voice our opinions through the vote.
Thank you both. Part of our conversation is being shaped by several organizations that we partnered with, and it's an acronym soup that includes the United Negro College Fund, or UNCF, the NAACP, the Divine Nine, Black fraternities and sororities, the American Association of Hispanics in Higher Education, and several others have partnered with us to shape a statement. And I'm sure Josh is going to post a link at some point to that statement that we released recently in firm agreement that we must make sure that we provide access of higher education for all, and make sure that no matter the decision that was reached, I can tell you from a lot of reading, a lot of work on this, we didn't lose a lot. We lost some, but we didn't lose a lot. And so the title that we came up with this webinar was, what did the Supreme Court decision not do, right? And so we want to talk about that. But before I go any further, there's a lot of acronyms floating around, and I got one screwed up, and I've already been checked on it. It was not AERA. It was the American Association of Higher Education, AABHE. And if you've never spent time working in higher ed, that's the only way we talk is acronyms. So I apologize to my friends in AERA. It was the American Association of Higher Education, which is disbanded, but it left us with this very powerful group known as the American Association of Blacks in Higher Ed. So, Professor Powell, what did that decision not do?
Well, it's really interesting. I think it is a narrow decision with broad implications. And our task is really to determine the scope of that decision by consistently maintaining its narrowness and so that it doesn't spread. So the court said basically four things. It said that Harvard's admissions program was unconstitutional under Title VII because it considered race too much. Same thing for the University of North Carolina under the 14th Amendment. Both the Title VI and the 14th Amendment are analyzed the same way, but constitutional violations because too much consideration of race. What's really interesting is that the court said maybe four basic things. One, there are no measurable objectives for the use of race. So what is this thing called diversity? Two, that race was employed negatively so that the impact on non-minorities was pronounced. The impact on whites and Asian Americans was pronounced because you're using race negatively to penalize those applicants. Racial stereotyping was prevalent. It assumes that members of racial groups act the same way and that there was no temporal time limit. In other words, we've always said that affirmative action has to end at some time. And what really troubled the court was it may never end, even though they cheated us out of the 5 more years that we would have under Justice O'Connor's timetable. But that was ridiculous in itself because she said 25 years to eradicate 400 years of oppression. So that's what the decision says. But what is really interesting is that Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson's dissent really makes Chief Justice Roberts have to answer this question. And even during oral arguments, she asked this question: can you really say that individual applicants in higher education have to erase their identity, have to not mention race at all? And he has to respond to that. And he does so in an opinion. And he says, we didn't say that a student can't talk about race. We just said that race cannot predominate in the admissions process. A student can talk about race in terms of their life experience, but on some level, the student has to contextualize that so that race isn't a predominant factor. So he says that there's broad agreement that universities, when they're considering an applicant's essay, can look at how race affected that applicant's life through discrimination or inspiration or community organizing. And that's very important. So doesn't totally erase race. It just says, we don't know what this diversity thing is. We don't know how to measure it. So we're going to say that race is used in an inappropriate way and it's unconstitutional.
I think Professor Powell did a wonderful job summarizing that. So I won't add too much, but I think it's important to emphasize, and it's a specific quote that always is resounding for me from the case when Justice Roberts says, he said, I want to make it clear, quote, nothing in this opinion should be construed as prohibiting universities for considering an applicant's discussion of how race affected his or her life, be it through, and here's what's important to me, discrimination, inspiration, or otherwise. And so for a higher education administrator, what does that mean? What do we tell students when they are applying in their college essays? What is legally permissible for them to include? And I think it's important for us to make sure the public is educated on that. And so some examples of ways students can discuss race in their college essays. The first one, discrimination. If you're the first Black violinist or Black soccer player at a predominantly white high school, you can talk about how you overcame any discrimination you might have experienced in that unique position or context. Inspiration, how you might have been inspired, again, being in a neighborhood that has a high minority, high poverty population, and you were able to overcome structural inequalities, barriers that typically prevent students in your area from transitioning or matriculating into higher education. So I think it's important in terms of our messaging in our application process that we have on our websites on educating students, because to be quite frank, the decision is doing what it was intended to do, which is to create a chilling effect. As Professor Powell said, it was a very narrow decision. It didn't completely tie our hands behind our backs, but a lot of people, especially children in our communities, they may be afraid and think, you know what, I've been told not to mention race at all in my college essay. To the contrary, no, we want you. We want to know your unique racial and ethnic background and how, despite those structural challenges associated with that, you overcame whatever obstacle or barriers to get to this point. And so as well, it's how we can also identify who those students are. And so we definitely want to encourage students to discuss contextually, again, as Professor Powell said, how they have either overcome discrimination, been inspired to do something such as start a nonprofit, or inspired to get involved with the Special Olympics, but something that gives us some indication of, again, their racial and ethnic background, not in a way that's we're not going to make a decision, obviously, based on that, but that context is helpful when we're making admissions decisions. And so I think it's really, really important to emphasize that in our messaging, that we encourage those stories, those shared experiences in their personal essays.
We are at the just short of the halfway point in our conversation this afternoon, or this morning again, for some of our friends. And I would ask, if you have questions, we have several questions remaining, but if you have particular questions and or comments, if you drop them in the chat and we get a chance to, we will address those. I think both of you mentioned, inspiration and discrimination, but for me, one of the key words is otherwise. Being able to articulate in your application how your race has impacted you. It doesn't have to be discrimination. It doesn't have to be inspiration. It can simply be as a Latino male coming up, and you go from there. As someone who's worked extensively his whole career in higher education, and access has been one of the key components of the work that I do in higher ed, we've been preparing for something like this all along. Our admissions processes have muted the emphasis on race prior to this decision. So not a whole lot is going to change for the admissions folks in higher education. But I think you both suggested that if we don't pay attention, there could be more. That this is not, necessarily a single action, that there could be other actions that follow. I want to ask a follow-up question to that, though. So you talk about things that students can do in their applications, their essays. What can higher education institutions do? What can those of us who are on this webinar, what can we do as practitioners to continue the momentum that we want to see in terms of access for all? And I'll start with you, Dr. McNeal. Go ahead.
Yes, sorry, I got jumped in. This is like the fun part. What can we actually do? Action items. I like to recommend what I call strategic activism. And what I mean by that is really looking at our mission and goals at our individual institutions of higher education, and looking at ways that we can strategically expand opportunities for our students of color. So specifically things such as targeted outreach. Nothing in the Supreme Court decision says that we can't target schools in Detroit that have high minority, high poverty populations. And so obviously being much more deliberate about targeting those particular schools that have demographics that would help diversify our student body. body. I think how we recruit students as well, students that may not be thinking of just making up Delaware State University or Illinois State University, where my parents live. So recruitment, meaning actively recruiting, setting aside funds in your budget to go out and recruit students that will help diversify your student body. And I think it's also to remember, out of all these things, that we still have a responsibility to not only acknowledge, but try to dismantle structural inequalities and systemic racism that cause the problem that we're having, meaning where our students arrive starting in pre-K at the schoolhouse doors with less than their white counterparts. And so we have to take a role as strategic activists in closing that gap. And so that's where pathway programs, I think, are going to be very important, investing in pathway programs, investing in pipeline programs. I was fortunate to work with a pipeline program through Michigan State University. It's called the Broad Scholars Program. And that program, we specifically targeted students or recruited students from Detroit as well as Chicago public schools. And we were able to change the demographics at Michigan State's College of Education by more than 50% in terms of Black teachers that we were training to go out into our schools. Again, Black teachers often have a very different, more often than not, a much higher standard for our students because they recognize the upward battle that they have in terms of matriculating successfully from high school to college. So I think having pipeline programs like the Broad Scholars Program, having targeted recruitment again and targeted outreach is going to be very essential. A lot of colleges and universities, to be quite frank, they don't really want to invest the time and money into pipeline programs because they are very expensive. But I would advocate in saying they're very effective when done correctly. And there's a lot of grant funding for those programs. It's just a reminder. I know we know that, but the Broad Foundation gave us initially $5 million for that particular program, and then they matched that time and time again. So I think it's important to invest in those three targeted approaches. Professor Powell.
Okay. Dr. McNeal and I both work on this notion of dismantling structural inequality. We did a symposium about 4 or 5 years ago that talked about that. And so our key objective is to try and look at systems and practices and structures that exclude. So building upon Dr. McNeal's notion of strategic activism, I think we also have to identify points of access. And we can do that substantively. There's something in the U.S. Supreme Court's decision that always talks about disproportionate impacts, and they're very important, but unless you can couple that with some type of discriminatory intent by the state, the court always ignores that. But I think that we can, in the real world, use that practically to our advantage. And what I'm talking about is thinking in terms of impacts, in terms of people who could be admitted to college, first-generation students, people who live in food deserts, people who receive Pell Grants, people who live in Detroit in the segregated school systems that were brought about by Milliken versus Bradley to show that those students can achieve academically. So maybe they are the top of their class and we would look at those. Connect to broader theme principles like leadership, voting, democracy, and really make an active attempt to constitutionalize or codify Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson's dissent. I encourage everyone to read her dissent. It is an absolute masterpiece, and it's probably the first time that a U.S. Supreme Court justice writes an opinion that focuses squarely on structural inequality and its impacts. I mean, in some ways, she really constitutionalizes the 1619 Project and makes it applicable to our present day situation. And that's a very strong pushback when you see the U.S. Supreme Court and other entities trying to erase history. It's no accident that there's this movement to get rid of critical race theory or don't mention anything that upsets people in the classroom or really sanitize U.S. history. There's a direct link in terms of the present day impact of past discrimination. So we have to push back creatively, and we don't really want to pick fights, but we shouldn't run away from them. We should resist this chilling effect.
Well, we could just about close the webinar with those two comments. I mean, you guys gave us some really strong bits of advice and ways in which we can move forward. I will echo, because we shared that in our first webinar, Ketanji Brown, Justice Jackson's response was masterful. It was on point. It was insightful, and it provides so much of the understanding that so many of us have had for years, that was now part of the record. And I think going forward, it will give a lot of people ammunition to attack some of these, to respond to some of these attacks. One of the things too we talk about is proactive, and the groups that I mentioned a little while ago that have joined us in addressing and responding to this is, as opposed to just responding, let's be proactive and take proactive measures. And so you both have just given us several ways in which higher education can do just that. I was reminded too, as Dr. McNeal was talking about, the way in which young students might be discriminated against based upon their income or the color of their skin or what have you. We've all, most of us anyway on this call, have experienced something like that. And now, how do we find a way to proactively prevent that from happening? We've talked about voting. We've talked about Congress. What are some of the other ways that as a collective or as individuals, we can get in front of this? I'll start with you, Dr. Powell.
I think we have to intervene more and be more actively engaged in advising students about the college process. I had that same experience. I was just thinking back years ago, of course, but sometimes college counselors aren't fully adept at understanding context and helping people transition from high school to college. So on some level, I lowered my expectations and the schools that I reached out to, because the college counselor was like, well, maybe you can't do that. So
excuse me, based upon what criteria did that counselor give you that advice?
Oh, no, just a presumption. It wasn't any criteria. I think I had the grades, but when you're 17 or 18, you don't have the confidence. And so I should have, thinking back as an older person, maybe I should have pushed back a little bit more. But I think there is no criteria. I think that's an important point that is oftentimes subjective. You look at a student, and even if they have really good grades, you say, well, let's just make sure and sort of lower your expectations to apply to these schools. I think we need to very aggressively tell students to apply to a wide array of schools that match their talent. So the high-end schools that may be somewhat out of reach, the middle tier schools that you'll get into, and then the safeties, but all of them should be schools that can meet your needs academically. And so one level, we have to sort of change the discussion about expectations and not let this decision have a chilling effect. I think if students are ambitious and they want to pursue these opportunities, we have to give them the context so that they can pursue them realistically.
And just a quick follow-up, when you said giving them the context, that was one of the, I think, biggest eye-openers for me in the pipeline programs that I have worked with. Little things that we take for granted, right? In terms of first-generational college students, we had understanding how important writing is. So having college professors taking students on taking a writing course. By the end of the course, we had a polished personal essay ready to be submitted. We did that with students their junior year. Things like that make a huge difference when that particular essay that has been edited by a college faculty member is before an admissions counselor. It's also talking to parents. A lot of parents don't understand that part of our requirements in that program is educating parents on the college process. So many of the parents said, I just told them to go to the military. The military will pay for school. These are kids that have a 4.2 GPA. Their parents not knowing otherwise or not knowing about other possibilities. So things such as that, as simple as talking to parents. So really, when we talk about our individual responsibilities, I just, the same applies as I said with voting with this. We have to get involved in the community. These pathway programs, in addition to partnerships, business partnerships with corporations, having a mentoring program. I think one of the most shocking moments of my life was on a plane. I was sitting next to a white gentleman. I'm the person that doesn't want to talk to you on the plane. I put my headphones on, but he kept talking to me and he actually tapped my shoulder. But what's important about that is he ended up being the lawyer who represented the University of Michigan in the affirmative action case. And I asked him, why, you as a white man, why were you willing to fight for affirmative action? Why were you willing to fight for equal education opportunity? And he told me that one day he was taking his 6-year-old daughter, driving in the car, and he said what most parents say, what do you want to be when you grow up? And she said a dentist. He said he expected her to say a princess or, a superhero. And when he asked why a dentist, she simply said, because my dentist looks like me. She has blonde hair and blue eyes. And I say that to say that story reminds me of the importance of our babies, our children, our brown and Black children, seeing people that look like us, that have matriculated through college and actually being able to interact and speak with us. And that's where those mentorships through partnerships come into play, business partnerships. That's where the pathway programs come into place. I can't tell you how many Black students that I've had in that program now have PhDs and MDs because they saw a Dr. Laura McNeal or a Dr. Professor Powell. So you'd be amazed how something as simple as access to those of us that have been able to make it to this level makes a huge difference as well.
We've got so much work to do, and you guys are now moving into the sphere of what do we do with our young people? How do we encourage them? Image is important, as you just mentioned, and how do we see ourselves participating fully? I want us to go to that, but I do see that the congressman is standing in front of George Washington. So we better let him get a few words in as he's trying to log on. Troy, can you hear?
Hey guys, yes, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you fine. And we're going to interrupt that part of the conversation. I mentioned just a little while ago, before, as we were getting started, Congressman Carter, that we have you at a limited amount of time because of the voting on the floor. So we're going to give you a few minutes to respond to a couple of questions, real quick questions. And then if anybody else has a question, we'll see if we get time for you.
If you would allow me just to make a quick opening statement, because I don't know when I'm gonna have to leave, then I'll be happy to field any questions.
Do that, sir. Do that.
But let me begin by apologizing for not being able to be with you from start to finish on this more than worthwhile discussion. As we speak in the nation's capital, we are history in the making and not good history. We've once again failed to elect a speaker. We've once again shown how dysfunctional the Republican caucus, our conference, is, and their inability to lead, inability to even find consensus within their own conference. And that denotes where we are in our country. And I will say at the core of all of this, when we talk about what has happened and will continue to happen with the Supreme Court, I'll make one basic sentence that we all should never forget. Elections have consequences. Elections have consequences. Because when we vote, we win, and when we stay home, we lose. We saw it happen in Louisiana this past weekend where we had 36% of the vote. And as a result of that, 10 people in the race, 1 Democrat, 8 Republicans, and the Republican won in a primary victory without the support, without any compromise. And we will see this kind of hideous practice continue, not only at the Supreme Court, which I know that's what we're talking about today, in affirmative action in higher education. It will continue to happen as people become more and more emboldened in their belief that we're not going to vote, that they can kick us, they can prod us, they can hurt us, and we will just roll over. So I don't want to preempt or trump all the good discussion about the specifics of what happened in the Supreme Court, but I would like to kind of jettison us forward to say, what are we doing about it? What are we doing about it? Because as long as we have the extreme members on the Supreme Court dialing back rights, dialing back the ability for us to advance, here we are as members of Congress with the largest Congressional Black Caucus that we've ever had before, and we're fighting for voting rights. Now, we're fighting for voting rights, but as I said on a radio show the other day, while we're fighting for voting rights to make sure that our voting rights are protected and enshrined in the law, even the rights we have are not being used. When we continue to see the lowest turnouts in history in elections that matter, we've got to rethink where we are. We've got to rethink our passion, whether it's from academia, nonprofit, community, business, government, or all of the above. Divine Nine, all of the groups and organizations, we have to really dial in on the fact that elections have consequences. And the result of our poor performance will continue to embolden the Trumps, the Jim Jordans, those who say we don't matter because we don't even know our own strength. And another thing that I say, and I will continue to say, that we as Black folk need to start talking more to each other and less about each other. We as Democrats need to join forces and push back against the racist attempt to bring us back to Jim Crow, the attempt to take us away from advancement and bring us back to hand to mouth. So I know that your discussion, and I apologize for venting this morning, but this is real time happening. This is not something we're reading about in a history book. This is happening in real time in our nation's capital and across the street at the United States Supreme Court. We, you, us, all. And as I point to you, I point to me, because we're all in this together. We all have a responsibility. But here's the good part. Not only do we have the responsibility, thank God we do have the power. They don't want us to know it. And they're so deathly afraid that we will wake up. That's why they attack woke. That's why they attack woke. Why would anybody be opposed to someone being awake? Because they'd rather keep you sleeping. When we vote, we win.
Wow, Congressman, for somebody who didn't hear the previous 20 minutes of our conversation, you really captured a lot of what we've shared. I mean, both of our panelists are law professors at Louisville, and they shared the importance of voting. They shared the importance of utilizing all three branches of government, not just the Supreme Court, but our legislative branch as well. Could you speak to the role that Congress is going to play going forward? We are so very proud of the fight that you guys have been doing in the failure to simply acquiesce and put in a speaker because of the urgency of now. But what role can Congress do to help us secure the victories that we've won before?
Continue to bring the discussion to the people. Continue to keep you engaged. Continue to make you a part of the effort. I'm so proud of our Congressional Black Caucus Chairman, Stephen Horsford from Nevada, who has really created a bigger platform, a bigger place, a safe place for people to come, to talk, to address their concerns, their issues, to really flex more into the mantra of being the conscious of the Congress, to being the conscious of the country. So Congress has multi-roles. One, we will continue to fight to push legislation forward to get, hopefully, to the president's desk. But here's the reality. We are short in our numbers in the United States House of Representatives. So we're limited because we don't have the votes to hold the gavel. In the 117th Congress, we had the votes, but we didn't have it in the Senate. So we passed monumental legislation that got to the Senate and stalled. But we also passed monumental legislation that we were able to get just enough of the other side. In the 117th Congress, we passed more monumental legislation than ever before. More dollars went to HBCUs than ever before. We put more money in mental health than ever before. We passed a $1.2 trillion infrastructure package that's fixing crumbling infrastructure and employing people. We put broadband in every community in the United States, not only those places where they didn't have access because there was no wiring or no fiber, but also communities where people simply couldn't afford it. So what can Congress do? We show up every day and we keep pushing and we keep fighting, but we can only do what we can do until we get numbers that are strong enough that we can take over the House and the Senate again. It's still a democracy, and we still have to have majority rule to advance these measures. And so I'll go back to my very earliest comment. Elections have consequences. We have got to get out and vote. We've got to educate our electorate, and then we've got to unify and get to the polls because they're banking on us not doing it. Now, the second part of what the Congress can do is to continue to be the moral compass, to continue to be the megaphone that keeps you informed on what's going on, using our platforms to be on events like this, to talk to noted professionals and leaders, whether it's in academia, the legal world, or what have you, to continue to demonstrate that we are here for you. Let us know how we can be more a part of these kind of activities, and we will let you know how you can be more a part of ours. Dr. Rovaris, my dear brother-in-law, was here during ALC, and you get to see some of the actions of what goes on during Black Caucus Weekend. It's not just a party. We have parties, but they're in the evening. All day long, we're working. We have meaningful sessions on things like this, on mental health, on education, on environmental justice, on criminal justice reform. So I'd encourage all of us to start piping up the discussion of how we all can come together, utilize the resources of members of Congress to support positions that you're doing back home, and collectively we can win.
Thank you so much. We have a couple of questions from the audience. We've got about 7 minutes left, and I want to get try to get to both of those questions real quickly, and then we'll wrap up with some closing comments. So my speakers, I want you to be ready. You'll have 30-second closing comments following remarks. The first question is, what are the implications of the SCOTUS decision for HBCUs? And that's an open question. Anybody can take a shot at it.
Well, let me give I'll give a quick shot, then I'll shut up and let the other panelists, because they've got a wealth in this area particularly. And I've got my phone is.
You're
sorry,
good.
Dad. We're having a little difficulty here. The implication obviously is, and I'll leave the more specific to the professors, but I will tell you the next implication is what's next on the chopping block. This has been a litmus test. Let's test this. Let's see. It began with the reversal of Roe v. Wade, and then affirmative action in higher education. What's next, professors?
I think really quickly, what we can expect to see, hopefully, is an increase in applications and enrollments at HBCUs, as well as more partnerships between HBCUs and colleges, PWI colleges. I know there is a partnership, I believe it's with Tougaloo College in Mississippi, an HBCU, and Brown University, which is, of course, is in Rhode Island. They've had a long-standing partnership that includes a pipeline program from high school to undergrad, as well as allowing students to take classes at both institutions. In terms of what
Dr.
the
McNeal, that goes even further. That goes into medical school. That pipeline was designed to increase the Tougaloo students who would go on to medical school at Brown as well.
Excellent. Thank you for adding that. So it goes beyond that.
Yeah.
And we need to do more of that. And in terms of what's next, I do agree that this is just the beginning. The continued dismantling of all of our rights and liberties is under attack. And I think we have to be more proactive in terms of what the Congress said instead of reactive to those things.
And I'll add another part to that. I'm sorry, Professor. One quickly, another part of that is I'm a proud product of Xavier University. My children are products of HBCUs. All my family are products of HBCUs. We have to then also make sure that we lean in and support HBCUs by encouraging our young people to recognize it and to prepare them earlier in their education to make sure that they are taking advantage of all the opportunities that are there. The chairman of Ed and Labor, or now ranking member under the Republican rule, is Congressman Bobby Scott, who has been incredible in fighting for funding Elma Adams, the representative from North Carolina, has been a stalwart and champion for HBCUs. We have to continue to circle the tent to give them the resources and encourage our young people to look at that as an option, even in the face of all that's going on. Professor, I'm sorry.
Oh, not at all. I think HBCUs will play a major role. People will be looking to them to provide leadership. But I think it's important for those institutions to maintain their strong identity. And that's even something that Justice Thomas ironically embraces. There's an old case called Fordyce where he talks about the unique traditions and contributions in breaking down barriers that HBCUs have. So we have to keep this narrow ruling from expanding broadly, as I said earlier. And one way to do that is to embrace the legacy, heritage, and exemplary tradition of HBCUs.
And I will add to the conversation, my graduate research was the historical development of Black education, particularly HBCUs. And one of the outcomes for this is that, as Dr. McNeal mentioned, there will be some more traction and traffic toward the HBCUs. But if we don't support them, as Congressman Carter mentioned, financially and other ways, especially those of us who are alums, alumni giving to HBCUs has to step up. We can't just rely on federal assistance and the monies that we got during COVID. We've got to support our institutions ourselves, because when they get more students, they're going to have more needs. And you can't serve more students with the same resources. So I actually met Congressman Carter at Xavier University, and I'll embarrass him a little bit and say that he was a political science student who only wanted to serve. And there was so much about politics that he was interested in. Dr. McNeal shared before you got on, I'm going to say Troy every once in a while, but
Troy's my name. It's okay.
Yeah, and he did mention brother a lot, but she mentioned there was a young lady who saw somebody who looked like the dentist, like she saw in her dentist somebody who looked like her, and you saw in as a student at Xavier others in front of you, and now you're in that position to role model for others. So I think we have to continue to support the ability for our students, and particularly our students at the HBCUs, to have those dreams and to continue to develop those dreams. But if we don't support those institutions, we can't expect them to work miracles with more students and the same resources.
And I will tell you along that line, Dereck, that you hit a point that's so critically important. I would not be standing here as a member of the United States Congress addressing you guys today if it were not for the leadership, tutelage, and love I received at Xavier University. I can say that without fear of contradiction. Now, I'll also pivot and say this to all the people that are on this call and all the people that may be watching at some point. Remember this. We are all here because we worked hard, somebody prayed for us, we were given a great opportunity, and we stand on the shoulders of great leaders that we saw, felt, and touched. We have to become those leaders for those that are behind us. And in doing so, we have to tell them not only our success stories, we have to tell them our failures.
Yes,
because somewhere along the line, they think we are here because we're special, because we're smart, because we're better than them. They need to know of all of our failures. They need to know that Troy Carter grew up in not the nicest of neighborhoods with 5 siblings and a mother who worked tirelessly to educate us and raised us by herself. They need to know that the road to success is filled with potholes and bumps and challenges. They need to know that we failed before we succeeded. They need to know that we're human and that if we can do it, they can do it. Don't just tell them, look at me, look what I have. Flip the script and tell them what you didn't have. Tell them where you failed. Tell them where you wanted to give up, but you didn't because somebody prayed for you, and be that somebody for the next generation of people and pay it forward.
We are excellent remarks, Congressman Carter, and we're going to use that as your closing remark. We've got about 50 seconds left. I'm going to give Dr. McNeal half of that, and Dr. Powell, you'll have the last word. Dr. McNeal.
I just want to end with a quote from Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson. I think it's very fitting. She says, quote, "The only way out of this morass for all of us is to stare at racial disparity unblinkingly and then do what evidence and experts tell us is required to level the playing field and march forward together, collectively striving to achieve true equality for all Americans." We have to get the village involved, and I think that's pertinent. Professor Powell.
In these troubling times, I think it is important to recognize that we are in a period that could be called the third Reconstruction, where forces are assembled against us to advance retrogression and retrenchment. And our duty, our task is to push back against that. And Dr. McNeal talked about Ketanji Brown Jackson's dissent. We all should read that because that is almost a game plan about how to reclaim everything that we are losing ground on. She talks about structural inequality. She talks about reclaiming the legacy of Brown. She talks about the vibrancy and potency of the Reconstruction Amendments. And all of our efforts should be centered around dismantling structural inequality. So it's excellent being here with you. I hope we continue this discussion, and we will continue to do everything we can on the ground to make space for engagement, activism, scholarship, that pushes us forward and helps us to reach the true substantive equality that we all are promised in America.
Panelists, I want to thank each and every one of you for taking time out of your schedules. Certainly Congressman Carter jumping off the floor to be with us. We could not have done this without you, and your expertise has been enlightening. And I hope it gives all of our audience members points of charge, not just question, but charge. Take the advice that has been offered, and we go to the next level. We continue to do the fighting that we have to do. AABHE will be there. There was a question in the chat about organizations getting in front of cameras. We're not in front of cameras. We're in front of people. We're in front of our members, our students, and those that will be coming behind us. And so we want to thank you on behalf of the organization. We thank you on behalf of our partnering organizations, 100 Black Men of America, NAACP, the Urban League, and so many others that have reached out and said we want to make a difference. Congressman Carter, I will yield the last 30 seconds to you. Go ahead, you got it.
I'm going to end with just thank you. Thank you, Dr. Rovaris. Thank you all the panelists. It's an honor to be with you. The struggle's real, but we can win. We can win when we show up. So again, God bless you all. Continue the incredible work that you have. And I'm going to make this offer again. Lean in and use us. And when I say that, I mean the entire Congressional Black Caucus. We stand ready. We're not passive, we're aggressive. We want to be there. We want to be the voice and the various jurisdictions that we represent and beyond. So consider us a full partner. Continue the great work, and thank you for allowing me to be with you.
Thank you all.